Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Thank you once again for joining us for today's Business Over Breakfast conversation. We have a new face and a slightly different topic today. Given how many of us are working in cross-generational teams, and given so many of us are working from home today and might be living 24/7 with our cross-generational families, it seems very appropriate to spend some time on thinking about how do we improve intergenerational communication. Our guide for this morning is Goizueta Business School Professor Molly Epstein. Molly's teaching is focused on effective communication and negotiations, and she combines a background in both language and business to help students and executives maximize their professional performance. Her areas of specialty and research include change communication, intergenerational communication, and communicating with gender intelligence. This morning, Molly is going to talk to us about improving team dynamics and increasing team productivity by learning how to communicate most effectively across what might be 5 generations in today's workforce, and how to do this in face of our current challenge, which many of us are dealing with, which is working remotely. Molly is going to kick off the webinar with some thoughts and observations about each generation and how this plays out in our teams, followed by Q&A. So please write your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and our team will do their best to get those to Molly to answer this morning. At the end of today's session, there will be a very short 5-question survey that we would appreciate you filling in, because that helps us figure out what other topics and sessions to provide you. Enjoy the morning, and I look forward to continuing the conversation next Thursday morning. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me for breakfast today, where we'll be talking about intergenerational communication. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so here we are. Here is a grandmother and grandson enjoying a little intergenerational communication. And as Nicola mentioned, we're all doing this type of intergenerational communication in our homes, in our families, in our communities. And now we've taken our work communication and moved it to remote formats. And the reason that this is particularly important right now is that oftentimes our generation affects our ability to feel comfortable with remote communication. And our generation affects the way that our teammates come to remote communication as well. So on the next slide, I want to mention something about generalizations. Now, this is a big disclaimer here. Generalization limits our understanding. It limits our understanding. However, we're going to be generalizing a lot today. We'll be generalizing a lot so that we can begin to understand the types of influences that each one of us experiences and how it shapes the way that we approach communication and remote communication specifically. So, disclaimer, and yes, we'll be doing it a lot. So let's go to the next slide. Today, we're going to go through an overview of the 5 generations that you may experience in your workplace. I'm going to learn a little bit about you via some surveys, so I can shape this content on the fly to make it the most meaningful to you. So do ask questions in the question box. Please feel free to ask any questions, and as you answer your survey questions, just choose the best answer. You might not know exactly, but just go with your gut, answer in the best way that you know how. We'll go through each of the generations, and then I'll answer questions after each one. So keep the questions coming. We'll make this as interactive as possible. Then we'll close out today by looking at some action steps, what you can do to make your communication that you're doing for your work remotely as productive as possible. Okay, so let's go. So today, there are potentially 5 generations in your workforce. The smallest segment is the silent generation, or our folks who are 77 or older. The next largest group is the baby boomer. Oh, excuse me, the next largest group is our millennials. Now, we all come to this with a lot of preconceived notions about what millennials are because they've been so much in the media. And we'll look at what is true about them and what's not. Next largest generation are our Gen Xers. That's my generation. Next is the boomers, and then our rapidly growing group of Generation Z. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at what these generations mean. So our silents, typified there by Warren Buffett, are those born between 25 and 44, 1925 and 1944. So the youngest ones are now 77 years old. And what shapes their approach to life and to work is a sense of duty, tradition, and loyalty. Next up are our boomers. We've got Oprah there. Individuality and tolerance. This is the generation that lived the civil rights movement and began to see changes happening both first on campuses and then in workplaces. This generation has also been criticized as being self-absorbed, the me generation, and seeking to learn as much as they can about themselves. Up next is Gen X. Gen X is born between 65 and 79. Their typified experience is one of diversity, living in the US, in desegregated schools. And this group is known to be particularly pragmatic and focusing on what they can gain from a job versus what they can contribute to the world. Our millennials, born 1980 to 1996. And this might be a little different than what you expect, and we'll come back and talk about that because the millennials were recently reclassified by demographers. And what we know about millennials, 80 to 96, is that they have an interest in authority, authorship, creating something new that didn't exist before, and finding ways to work that are autonomous, doing it in an autonomous manner. Moving on to our Gen Zs, 97 to 2010. This group is quite different, and their focus is on security, both financial and physical, and creating balance between work and life. They refer to it as a work-life blend. And then personal growth. So that's our big picture overview. Let's go to our next slide. So here's our first survey question. What generation are you? I should have put an other in there, although I think I've got them all covered. But so let's launch that survey, and I want to find out a little bit about you so I can understand what's important to you today. Wow, interesting. No X. Okay, we've got some Xers. Do we have any Zs here? There's our Z, yep. Baby boomers, okay. And I'm gonna jot this down so I know. Okay, great, thank you. So let's end that poll, and we see that Gen X represents the largest part of the poll. Interesting, thank you so much. Very interesting. Let's go to our next poll. Polling question number 2. There we go. Who do you manage? And this is where you'll want to just take your best guess. We don't know. Oh, good, the 100%'s no one. Who do you manage? Okay, very interesting. Keep them coming in. Okay, so it looks like this is pretty typical of management scenarios in America in general right now. So that we have the majority of the respondents are Gen Xers, and the majority of those that report to you or those that you manage are millennials. So that is pretty typical of what we see in workplaces across America today. I love that many of you are free agents and you don't have to manage anyone. So congratulations to the 22% who don't have to manage anyone. That sounds like a very free life that you have there. We've got Gen Z at 26%, and we've got some Xers at 39%. Okay, great. Very helpful to me. All right, we've got another question here coming up. Poll 3. To whom do you report? Again, our best guess is going to be helpful here. To whom do you report? More people who are their own boss. I love it. Okay, we've still got a little bit of movement here. So, great. The majority of you reports to someone who is a Gen X. This is really helpful. More of you are presenting to or reporting to Gen X. That's helpful for me to know, and I can tailor my comments to that. Next greatest group is the Boomers at 28% and Millennials at 14%. Okay, great. So what we're seeing here is that for those of us participating in the seminar today, most of you are Gen Xers. The majority of those reporting to you are millennials, and the majority of you report to Gen Xers. Great, very helpful. Okay, I believe we have one more question. Ah, yes, okay. So this one, in the last week, check all of these that you used for a work scenario. You used for a work scenario. Okay, it looks like we've got a lot of the votes. No, we've still got some coming. I'll be more patient. So what we're seeing is pretty typical. Zooms, Teams, other conference software, we're at about 95% there, which is what I would expect. On the computer is 95%. On your phone, about 53%. We'll talk, when we talk about the generations, about how different generations view computer versus phone versus other devices. I see you're chatting a lot. Texting, chatting, real time, great. Voice telephone, 76%. I'm jotting this down so I can remember. And then face-to-face, good for you. Face-to-face meetings for 20% of you. I guess that's a sign that we are getting back to in-person And I should have put another question in there about face-to-face with masks. I'm going to assume everybody had on a mask or was 10 feet apart. So great, thank you, thank you, thank you. If you have any reflections on what we've just seen in the polls, please go ahead and put those in the chat or the Q&A, and we can notice any themes that emerge. But this is really helpful to me so that I can get to know you, and it's not just me making assumptions. Okay, great. So let's move on to the next slide. I guess I need to close this out on my screen. Okay, good. There we go. All right. So again, like I said, we're going to go back to the fact that we are well aware of the fact that we're talking about generalizations here. But unless I were to come into your organization and do a deep dive into your specific situation, I need to just go with generalizations at this point. So again, a little disclaimer. Let's go to the next slide there. And what I've done in my remote work is that I have taken a look at the comfort level of the different generations working in remote communications. We're going to go through each one of these specifically and address the generational influences and their attitudes, but I wanted to give you this big picture here so that we are all using technology. And as we go to the younger and younger generations, we're seeing a greater and greater comfort level with that remote communication. So this is right now very young information. I'm in the process of collecting it and analyzing it, but I thought I would share it with you, and I'd love to hear your reactions on it. Helpful, not helpful, accurate, doesn't work for me. Whatever you respond is very helpful to me. But we're going to look at these. Which generations experience high comfort with technology? And we're seeing there with our green dots, it's the younger generations that experience it. Value virtual relationships as real. And here we have every generation does. There's nobody that says, no, I don't. We have Gen Z as the most comfortable with that sense of virtual being real. Enjoy exploring ideas in face-to-face formats, including Zoom and FaceTime. Yes, absolutely. Oh, someone says, I think there's a typo. Okay, we'll fix that. Thank you. All of us enjoy the idea exchange, and I was very pleasantly surprised to hear from the silence about how much they are gaining human connection through the remote face-to-face formats. Fast-paced idea exchange, those fast text, chat, Slack, all those things that are really fast-moving. We find that our youngest folks have the greatest sense of comfort with that, high comfort levels, leveraging technology to connect. Everybody is doing that. And this data point here with the silence, we're going to dive into that because that's a sociological phenomenon that I find really fascinating. High comfort adopting new technologies. Most of us, most generations in the workplace are very, very comfortable with it. Silence are less so. And for all the generations, with the exception of silence, they're preferring technological solutions to work challenges. So in general, what we have here is a big picture snapshot of the comfort level of these various experiences with remote. So let's move to the next one. What we see with generations is that we have the highest concentration of what we call the generational characteristics in the middle of those birth years. With generations, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but rather a measurement of a spectrum or intensity. So we have the most of what we consider those typical characteristics for those who are born in the middle. And of course, you might be someone who is in that generation, but you identify with a different generation. And that's okay too. We all experience culture and our peer groups in different ways. But we are going to be looking at generalizations for folks in the US here. So let's go to the next one. This is our wait, what moment? And this goes toward our Gen Zs. Now, Gen Z has been called our wait what generation because they're so distracted by their technology that they frequently miss what's happening in front of them real time. Let's go to the next slide. It used to be that millennials were 1982 to 2002. However, the Pew Research Center has reclassified the dates of millennials because of some of the sociological changes that our post-millennials are experiencing at such a rapid rate, primarily led by technology. So what they did, the Pew Research Center, they went back and they reclassified and they said, we're seeing so many changes in those born after 96 that we are going to change the titles. And we're not going to name those post-millennials. We leave that up to you, generational researchers, marketers, et cetera, to create what's next. So let's go to the next slide. And what we see is that it has emerged as Gen Z. So Gen Z and Centennials are the generation that comes 97 to 2010. Let's go on to our next slide. So what I see is the same slide. Keisha, can you move us to our next slide? Let's go to the next. Oh, there, okay. Let's go to the next. Yeah, perfect. Let's go to that next one that had the silence. Okay, great. So here we have the influences of the silent generation. And while very, very few of you said that you have silence in your workplace, I want to address this because it is the foundation of many of our businesses. So when we look at the silent generation, they were influenced very much by the jazz age, by the beginning of breaking down of barriers that came along with World War II. They faced the Great Depression. They faced women entering the workforce with our Rosie the Riveter there. And the car culture became a really big piece of the influence for the silent generation. We have McCarthyism there as well, the Red Scare, where folks were very scared to express ideas or in any way be considered outside the acceptable realm, which was not communism. So anti-communist was very important at this point, and it caused an environment where folks were afraid to speak their mind and afraid to be different. I mention this because with our more recent generations, being different, being your authentic self and voicing your opinions has great value. So let's move on. So our silent characteristics, and this is, of course, Jimmy Carter, an American president and also an Emory professor. The silents were duty-bound to overcome hardship. And their working style was one that was very goal-oriented, nose to the grindstone, hardworking, and focused on achieving without complaint, right? Walking uphill in the snow to school both days and not at all complaining about it. Their approach was discipline and action-oriented and conservative in values as well as consumption. You may have a silent in your life who saves all the aluminum foil, who is shocked at the amount that other generations consume. So let's go to our next slide. And this is the, oh my, technological advances have been so great and so fast. And I wanted to give you an example. So this is my dad. He passed away in January, a huge loss to all of us, but Lieutenant Commander in the United States Navy. And this picture's in about 1954. He was born in 1932. And his communication expertise was Morse code, celestial navigation, which is navigation by the stars using lots and lots of math. That's what this little picture with the globe is here. How do we use the stars to navigate and find our way? And dead reckoning, which is navigation of a ship or other craft using only landmarks. So, oh my, we're in such a different place today. Let's go to the next slide. This here is how we navigate today. So all of that dead reckoning and celestial navigation got us to where we are, because those things are tools that were used to create the Google Apps map phone that you're probably using every day. And so the shift is so enormous that it's hard for us to keep up and remember. Next slide. But one of the things I want to mention as a sociological influence is the fact that, especially now in the time of quarantine, COVID-19, that our elders are becoming more and more familiar with technology because they need to connect with others. This woman in the red sweater is my Aunt Barbara, who's in an elder living center, and her caregivers allow her to FaceTime with us. And then they send out pictures of her with her little note that she sent to everyone. You are a sweetheart, Sheila. How is Rosie doing? And here we see in multi-generational families connecting with others by technology. And this is what influences that silent generation fact that those relationships on technology are real and that they enjoy connecting face to face. So an interesting sociological phenomenon. And that's everything that we just went through here, where we get that green, leveraging technology to connect with community and socialize. All right, any questions on silence?
Hi, Molly. Thank you. Yes, we do have a question. For those of us that may be working with senior leaders that are boomers and silence, how do we address their comfort level with remote communication, as so many of us are shifting to that style?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really important question. So thank you for asking it. Know that that visual face-to-face is really important to previous older generations, that face-to-face piece. So tech support is key, right? Tech support is incredibly important. And if you find that your senior leaders are uncomfortable with their technology, I recommend that you immediately shift to something that they're very comfortable with, which is the phone. So you may choose to have your senior leader joining an important meeting by telephone versus Zoom or Teams or whatever might be challenging at that moment. Keep those relationships, your relationships with those leaders alive through whatever is working for them. So we know that for silence and for older boomers, technology is really helpful in their use of socializing, and see if you can't find out what they're doing now to connect with family and friends and expand that into the work setting. But telephone is always a familiar and effective way to connect. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you, Molly.
Okay, great, excellent. Okay, let's move on. Who's next? It's our boomers, right? So let's go to our next one. We all know a lot about boomers because they have dominated the media. If you are an Xer, you have lived in their shadow. I know there are a lot of boomers on today, and the majority are Xers. So we know that the boomer influences were conflict, civil rights, conflict being the fact that we were at war, and this was the first time that an American society at home hadn't supported that war in such a vocal way. Women's rights became so important, and women began to gain a foothold. There was music that galvanized the generation, as well as a lot of upheaval regarding the leaders who were talking about and bringing us change, and so much violence in society. All of these leaders that you see here in the picture were executed. And there was a huge movement for young folks to not trust anybody over 30. And that's that that button you see down there in the corner. So our boomers lived in a time of great upheaval and transition, and they were able to bring about huge change. Let's go to the next slide. So our boomers are still dominating the workplace in many ways because they hold so many senior roles. We see them as passionate arbiters of values, that they are leading not just with ideology, but also with thought systems. And their working style is one of disseminating knowledge and worldviews while creating culture. The approach is really thinking and feeling rather than relying on facts. So what we see for the boomers here is that they enjoy the remote face-to-face, and they embrace technology as the solution to technological challenges, to work challenges. They see technology as a real resource to solve things. Comfort level is not as great as those with younger generations. And that fast-paced interaction is a little bit less desirable. But what we know is that they are using technology to connect and communicate. So let's go to the next slide, which is about questions. There's so much information in our lives and in the media about boomers, but I'll answer any questions that you might have about them.
Molly, just a clarifying question. Are you suggesting that boomers don't rely on facts?
No, thank you for clarifying that. That boomers were the first generation to take facts and then ultimately go with their gut. That there was a real sense of confidence in self, confidence in their collective generational decision-making, and to make decisions that were influenced heavily by gut.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from someone that works with many boomers and millennials, but very few Gen X, and it's created some communication barriers. So could you address speaking and communicating effectively across the generations?
Absolutely. So we're about to get to Gen X. So how about if we move forward to Gen X, and then if those questions still exist, we can answer those. Sounds good?
Thank you.
Okay, sure. So Gen X cultural influences. So Gen X was very much in the shadow of the boomers for, well, pretty much they still are, right? In the shadow of boomers, and Gen Xers were the first generation to grow up in a time of mass divorce, and therefore they had a lot more freedom. The American family began to disintegrate in that divorce became prevalent, and Gen Xers had the first experience being the latchkey kids, that they were largely unsupervised after school as more and more moms went to work and more of their time was left to themselves. So there was a real sense of running wild, unsupervised for our Gen Xers, and they became very independent thinkers, very independent and not as social. So there's a lot of hostility between Gen X and baby boomers. So if you'll go to the next slide, we'll see that this cover of the Philadelphia magazine says, "Dear baby boomers, just die already. Love, Generation X." And the hostility between Gen X and boomers was, and still is, pretty heavily influenced by the fact that the boomers had such a voice that was heard, and Gen X has not felt as heard. So let's go to the next slide. What we see with our Gen Xers is that they are regarded to be alienated pragmatists, that Gen Xers in general are not group-oriented, and their working style is more about pursuing entrepreneurial ventures and free agency, that they are looking to build skills and portable careers that enable them to create self-protection and the ability to protect themselves, which is self-protection. So that was quite redundant. Their approach is efficiency, getting things done as quickly and easily as possible, like leveraging technology when possible. Innovation, doing things in a new way, and then customizing approaches for various situations. So I want to tell you a story here. This is Dietmar Exler, who is the CEO of Mercedes-Benz USA, born in 1970. So he's a pretty solid Gen Xer. And whereas boomers were very protective of the millennial generation, the millennials are mostly children of boomers. Some are children of Xers, but we had adopted in organizations and in many school settings this everybody gets a trophy mentality. And that never quite sat right with Gen X. So Dietmar and his team were so generous with their time, and they ran a case competition for the core communication class that I teach to undergrads. And Dietmar came in and he said, now, I know that we're not supposed to pick a winner, but that's not how the world works. We're going to pick a winner of the case competition. And they did. And this caused a lot of shock and surprise. And it was a great example of how a Gen Xer sees the world very pragmatically and sees that there are winners and losers, and they want to advance the very best rather than reward everyone with a trophy. So it was the case competition was a huge success. The students learned a tremendous amount, and they also got a little taste of Gen X reality, or excuse me, yeah, Gen X reality. All right, let's go to our next slide. So what do we know about our Gen Xers with their comfort with remote communication? They don't have any red in here, right? They're more comfortable with the fast-paced texting formats. They experience a high level of comfort with technology. I, like many Gen Xers, learned to use a computer at a young age with that little boxy Mac. So we have been using technology, whether it was a TV remote control as children, but as we became adolescent, we embraced technology. The Xers are not as social and they don't embrace the virtual relationships as entirely real, but they're willing to work with it. We leverage technology to connect and socialize. In general, Gen X is not terribly social. We're seen as more loners. There have been a lot of really great memes and articles about how Gen X loves quarantine because we hated people anyway. And that's been a meme theme that's moved around quite a bit. Gen X, happy to embrace new technology, not like on fire with it, but effective and happy to do it. And embracing technological solutions, understanding that most of our solutions can come through technology. So when we look at most of the apps that are on your phone right now, most of those were created by Gen Xers and millennials. If you look at your Google Maps, etc. All right, so how do we, let me go back to that question that was posed earlier. How do we cross that divide between boomers and Xers? And really, Xers want to do well and they want to communicate and have a happy workplace. However, they're not encultured as a generation to have these long, emotive conversations. So how do you cross that? And it's going to largely be through cross-cultural communication, where you are going to begin with questions about, so if you're a boomer, that's where that question came from, right? If you're a boomer and you need to have cross-cultural communication with a Gen X, you've been doing that now for, gosh, 25, 30 years in the workplace. Start with asking how they like to receive information and what their comfort level is. In fact, I'll share with the exec ed team some materials I've created specifically for how you break that barrier between boomers and Gen Xers, because it is a really tough one. There is that hostility that's automatically built in, and it can be difficult to overcome. But there are lots of tactics, and most of them will involve boomers meeting Xers in their efficient space and in the pragmatic getting it done style. I know that's not like an incredibly thorough answer, but I'll be happy to provide more information about it.
Thank you, Molly. And a question related to that too. If you manage boomers and Xers that may be on the cusp, would you manage those in the same style?
Right. So our success,
manage those generations if they're on the cusp?
Our success as managers is dependent on our ability to connect with each one of our employees. And so we will need to connect in different ways with our boomers than we will with our Xers. And for example, Gen Xers are not necessarily as receptive to your feedback, and they don't crave your feedback. We'll find the next generations crave feedback. Boomers are going to want that feedback, and they're going to want to talk about it, whereas Gen Xers will probably just say, okay, thanks, and then honestly dismiss your feedback. So I would say customize each one of your relationships based on the individual needs, which you can gain a better understanding of by looking at their generation and asking questions.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let's move on to our millennials, right? We know a ton about millennials because they have been watched and studied and marketed to since the very moment that they were born, 1982. So things that have influenced our millennials are that they came into a world that was focused on connection, lots of connection. The first millennials are the children of boomers, and that's what that snowflake represents there, that our boomers were very careful, attentive, loving parents. Our millennials were the first generation that the majority of the children were planned. Most millennials were born to mothers that were slightly older and more educated. They're also the first generation where the families become significantly smaller. So there's fewer competitions for resources. So that's where our special snowflake piece comes in. Everybody gets a trophy. There's a lot of focus on the development of the psyche and the well-being. The millennial children were raised in a high-stakes testing environment where they were always stacked up against their peers. They always knew where they stood. Think ACT, SAT, the Iowa test, the learning assessments that followed them through all of their years. They came into a world that really hoped that they could do a better job, that they could create a sense of responsibility for the environment, and that they could help us with this recycling image represents helping with the environment, helping to create solutions, which they have done, create solutions and policy to help save our environment. They also saw the first family of color in the White House. They are more diverse than any generation before them, the millennials, and they began to see themselves reflected in our elected officials and in our people of power. So very different perspective. They also experienced 9/11, where suddenly the world became a very scary place. And they were trained in different ways to protect themselves. So let's go to the next slide. They're also digital natives. So our millennials embraced technology as toddlers. They began using iPhones, laptops, iPods, and that their world became very customized, that they didn't turn on the radio, they chose their music on their iPod. As a result of using technology, millennials are the first generation to create and develop different brain pathways, that they process information differently than generations before them, and they're able to multitask and serial focus. So their brains truly are able to do things in different ways than those generations before them. Their characteristics are that they are very upbeat. They are the baby on board generation where they got lots of trophies. They're upbeat, risk-averse achievers. Risk-averse comes from that high-stakes testing environment, that they don't want to step outside the prescribed lines, that they were given a very clear pathway to success. Their working style is to seek stability, community, and opportunities for civic involvement. Volunteering is very important to millennials. Being engaged in the community and giving something back is a really important piece. Millennials love teams. They love working in teams. Now remember what we said about Gen X. They're loners typically. Our millennials love teams. If you think about what the classrooms looked like for millennials, they were seated in pods as children, and group learning was the norm. They're very social, and their ability to leverage technology enabled them to have that sense of really engaged social connections. They want work-life balance, but they're very, very willing to work hard. So this young man here is worth $5.4 billion. This is Bobby Murphy, a Stanford grad who co-founded Snapchat and was born in 1988. So in case you weren't feeling like an underachiever, Bobby Murphy today is checking out his net worth of $5.4 billion. Next slide. Something fantastic about millennials is that so many millennials have found a platform to share their amazing ideas. Whereas Gen X was inwardly focused, we have such creativity and diversity. This is Imani Ellis, and she founded the Creative Collective of New York City, of NYC, a community and creative agency dedicated to facilitating brave spaces for multicultural creatives. I love that saying, and I have been following her for a while because I'm so interested in the way that she is opening up doors to people of color and new ideas. And she is the visionary behind culture.com, which is like well, I'll just tell you, I'll read what I wrote here. The fastest growing conference for creators of color today. So much creativity and just a vibrant sense of embracing all of the voices of the millennial generation and other generations as well. So millennials are the most multicultural generation to their date, but they're also making their voices heard in wonderful, creative, and engaging ways. So what we have for our millennials is all yellow and green, right? Mostly green. They are really comfortable with technology. They are very team-oriented. That's why I can imagine that's why they responded with the yellow in the virtual relationships, because they love to be physically together, sharing ideas. Think of those pods in the classroom. Fast-paced idea exchanges fit their brain pathways. If you ever have sat side by side with a millennial or a Gen Z and you've watched them work a computer, their speed is dizzying. And that's their comfort level. That's what they do well. They're fast at engaging, processing, and moving on to the next one, making those connections. Great at technology. And so for millennials and Gen Z, this remote communication was custom tailored for them. This facilitates their eventual move into all of the leadership roles because they're so comfortable leveraging technology and creating technological solutions in a way that previous generations find takes a little bit more effort. So our millennials and remote communication are a really, really good fit. Most of them were already exploring ways that they could work from home before we had to work from home. So what questions do you have about millennials?
Molly, this is a question from a Gen Xer. Younger generations don't always have the perspective and experience that a Gen Xer may have.
Correct.
How can we best assert our perspective and experience in business with millennials who are so self-assured of their knowledge due to their leadership and understanding in social media, which is so dominant today, even though they're less knowledgeable in business than someone, say, at the age of Gen X?
Yeah, that's a really rich question. I would love the detail in it. And one of the best things that you'll be able to do as a Gen Xer, or if you're a boomer, is to create a personal relationship with your millennial. Whether you're managing them or you're working on a team together, personal relationship and connection is incredibly important. And the more you have that relationship and connection, the more they're going to be willing to listen to your perspective and then be open to understanding that your knowledge is based on many more years and many more life experiences. But it's going to be based on personal connection. It's a short answer.
No, thank you. And
I can also direct you toward more materials that delve more deeply into that.
Thank you. And do you feel like, I know we're about to talk about Gen Z, but do you feel like the behaviors of Gen Z and millennials will change over time as they grow, take on new responsibilities, and have new challenges?
Yes, but the fundamental approaches to life and work remain fairly consistent across a lifetime. Fairly consistent. Let's go into Gen Z, and then I can address some of those things. Okay, so who is Gen Z, also known as Centennials? I have adopted Gen Z because it's what we're seeing most in the literature around generations. They're born 95 to 2010. So I have lots of Gen Z children in my life right now, teaching me during quarantine how more and more about them. But they were born into a world where the internet was prevalent, that they had constant access to the World Wide Web in most cases. So information is abundant and always coming at them. And they are great at consuming information. They came initially into a world that had this millennial optimism, and then we hit the financial crisis. And so for American Gen Zs, this really changed the way that they look at security, that they experienced many of their parents or family members losing jobs. They experienced having to tighten the belt of the family and perhaps move somewhere else where there was work, as well as experiencing the culture that has resulted from global terrorism. These are the kids that have school shooting practices almost on a monthly basis in their high schools. What we find is that because the world changed significantly for the millennials and the Gen Zs, and that's why the Pew Foundation created that new block, the new block for Gen Z, they're more similar to Gen Xers than to millennials. So what we're hearing from our Gen X managers is, ooh, I really like these kids. They get me. They get me, in that they have a similar attitude. So let's go to the next slide. So we're still learning about Gen Z, but when we look at what they value, we see that they have a real passion for mission and values. Mission and values of the organization they choose is really, really important to them. That they will work for companies and buy from companies that are consistent with their values. They value security and financial stability more than previous generations because of what they experienced during the financial crisis. So they will choose jobs that have greater security and more of a long-term prospect than we see the millennials doing. They have had technology in their hand, their pocket, their eyes, most of their lives. And rather than work-life balance, what Gen Z refers to as a work-life blend, in that they don't see the hard stops between work and social. And so they're more willing to take phone calls at off hours or do Zooms at off hours and meld the social and the work communities together. They're very focused on personal growth and career planning. They love education and will continue to seek out certificates and degrees and specialties as they grow in their careers. They really like to have a plan because they want security. So that career planning piece is really important to them. Because they've seen data breaches and external influence in the media, more than any other generation, they're focused on privacy, security, and protection. So it's very important to them to have that sense of security. They love performance management and rewards as well, that sense of measurability. So let's go to the next slide. Their influences are the things that I have briefly mentioned here, and that they've constantly had Wi-Fi. In the last months, they've experienced COVID-19, which I'm sure will affect them in ways that we can't yet imagine. But the push to the remote work has really played to their strengths and will create their desire, will enforce their desire to not go back to the typical workplace. They're very focused on social justice, and they're really aware of the challenges facing the world today, the environment, the financial well-being of states and organizations. They're going to see a contraction based on this recession we're experiencing, and I'm very eager to see how they respond to it. So let's go to the next slide. So these folks here are Emma Gonzalez and David Hogg, who started the Never Again movement in response to school shootings. So we've said earlier that they're mission-driven achievers, that their working style is focused on stability. They use disruption through innovation, creating apps using the internet, group funding, groups created in cyberspace. Their approach is to act independently and to innovate with technology to bring about change. What we're seeing is a real mission-driven attitude and the willingness to work really, really hard. We haven't heard anyone say so far that Gen Z is lazy. So let's go to the next slide. They are set up to succeed in remote communication. They have a tremendous knowledge base that they can share with us. So when I talk to students who are not particularly savvy with technology, I tell them, you need to get savvy, because the old folks like me expect you to be able to come in and lead us through the technological experiences. That's our expectation of you. And they can grab it so quickly because they've been with it their whole lives and they've been connected to it. So what questions do you have? We can go through that. You can look at this on your own time, the 30 under 30. These kids are doing amazing things already. They're already changing the world. So let's go to the next slide. What questions do you have about Gen Z and remote?
Molly, don't have any specific questions related to Gen Z, but certainly interested in finding out next time what your thoughts are on generation after Gen Z. Sure,
yeah, sure. And so I know that we are at the very, very end of our time. If you want to go to those next step slides, I have some suggestions here. That's a recommended read. My action steps are to begin a conversation. So increase your awareness of generational influences, learn about how your generation influences you, and ask your colleagues how their generations may shape them. And on the next slide, some suggestions about how to actually begin those conversations. Ask with which generation do you identify and how so? In what ways have they shaped you? In what ways do you prefer to contribute? So really, I hope that the number one thing that you take away from this experience is to have conversations about this and find out how your teams and how your colleagues view remote communication and how their generation might tie into that. Because the more we have those conversations, the more we're able to understand who does what well and how they prefer to contribute, so that we can begin that cross-cultural, cross-generational communication that enables us to get the very, very best outcome and to engage the greatest number of people. So feel free to contact me directly with questions. Happy to continue to answer and provide any help that I can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Molly, for joining us today. And we want to thank you all, our wonderful attendees who come back each and every Thursday for our Business Over Breakfast webinar series. We really appreciate you all joining us.